My name is Robert Tathala. This is the story of Garrett Markish, a junior at Telford High School in Telford, Missouri when I was a senior, in the year 2004. What happened with Garrett Markish can be compared, of course, to the story of the Columbine massacre and others in which the rage of a young man burst forth in a nightmarish way against his classmates. But it is also a story like no other in history. Because I knew Garrett, and his fate became so intertwined with mine, I feel I am most able to speak about the days leading up to the tragedy that killed 77 people on the night of May 5th of that year. Garrett Markish appeared at our school 3 weeks into my senior year, and right away he met the profile of the loner and the outcast. The type who has so much trouble navigating through the high school years without being bullied or emotionally abused in some way. Garrett was very thin, kind of short, with long black hair. He had very soft features, making him appear somewhat effeminate. His clothes were usually mismatched, not that he ever made much of an effort in that department, normally wearing the same thing most days, old jeans and a plain t-shirt. He drifted through the halls looking like he wanted to be anywhere else, speaking to virtually no one. At lunch he usually went to the library or sat by himself on the hill overlooking the football field where some kids congregated to smoke. I would sometimes see him out there reading a book, usually science fiction as I recall. I heard he played the guitar a little and listened to goth music. You couldn't call him nerdy. He was merely alone and disinterested in human contact. I never had a class with Garrett, though from what my friends told me, he sat silently writing in a notebook in every one, volunteering nothing, doing the work when he felt like it, not bothering when he didn't. As someone who'd been bullied a little back in elementary school, I could identify with Garrett and felt bad for him, as did any student with a conscience. But like most people 17 or 18 years old, I was too selfishly caught up in my own life to think much about him. If I saw him coming down the hallway toward me, I would nod, getting one in response about half the time. Sometimes I considered talking to him, but for whatever reason, I just never did. I suppose it was inevitable that at some point, some insensitive student would start to cause a problem for Garrett. It was a little after Halloween of 2003 that Kirk Nevitt, a senior and a reserve player on Telford High's basketball team, started in with Garrett. I wasn't exactly sure how it began. Apparently Kirk had asked a rude question of Garrett between classes and didn't like the response. He'd shoved Garrett up against a locker and walked away before any teachers went past. From that point on, Kirk adopted a pet nickname for Garrett, which was ridiculously profane. He and I didn't mix in the same circles, so I wasn't privy to the daily interaction between the two of them, but I knew they had a class together, American government, and that they sat in the same row, separated by 2 students. Eventually, Kirk took to shooting the occasional spitball at Garrett and referring to him as Dr. Frankenstein, a misguided and vague reference to the kinds of books Garrett sometimes carried around with him, old dusty things with no jackets, the contents of which were a total mystery. On December 19th, there was a real incident. They were in class, and Kirk had thrown a pen at Garrett when he thought Mr. Harrison wasn't looking. This time, Garrett took it and fired it back, hitting Kirk right in the eye. Kirk had erupted, and Mr. Harrison took both of them outside in the hallway. The students in the classroom couldn't hear Kirk's protests as he was chastised. Garrett returned to the class, but Kirk didn't. It's almost hard for me to believe sometimes that someone could be that childish, that hurtful. But that was Kirk Nevitt. There were rumors that there would be a fight, but nothing developed, thank God. Even in 2003, the word fight in a public high school could mean something pretty scary sometimes. Fiona Beloit, a girl I'd known since elementary school, was in that American government class, and she told me she was a little unnerved by Garrett's reaction to Kirk's taunting. He'd never acknowledged it once before, just completely ignored the spitballs and the laughter and the rude notes, until the thing with the pen. When Garrett had returned to class, he'd spent the last 15 minutes of the period silently opening and closing his right hand in a claw on the top of his desk, slowly and almost methodically, over and over again, like a machine, as if he wasn't even aware of it. He was staring out the window and never looked away from it. He was out of school the next 2 days and then came back. There had been no suspension for Kirk, and so he was back too. Garrett's locker was defaced with profanity a week later, a typically immature move by Kirk. And that was where things seemed to leave off when Christmas break came on the 23rd of December. I got a call from a friend of mine on the 29th telling me that Kirk Nevitt was missing, and had been since the 27th when he'd gone out to meet some friends at the Redstone Mall. My father was a detective for the Missouri State Police, and he became involved in the search for Kirk. And I tried to give him some background about the little I knew about him, who Kirk hung out with at school, that kind of thing. I told him Kirk was a bit of a bully, and that led to me telling him about Garrett Markish. The last anyone had seen of Kirk, he was looking at the show times posted outside the movie theater box office near the mall food court. His friends said he never showed up to meet them on the other side of the mall. Kirk lived just a half-mile away and had no car. It was so strange seeing his face in the local news. His parents were shown too, and they looked more visibly upset than I had ever seen actual people on TV. At dinner on the 29th, my father told me that there had been no history of problems in the household, and he and his partner on the case, Bert Dale, didn't know of any obvious reason Kirk should leave home. His grades had even been pretty good, and he was intending to enroll at the local community college. There were virtually no leads. He had simply vanished. I mentally steeled myself for the return to school and the sad atmosphere that would greet us all. At 5:30 on the morning of December 31st, one of Telford High's janitors entered the school to start preparing it for a major snow which was forecast for the area that night. Part of his task was to check and alter the thermostat settings all around the building. He walked through the dark hallways, checking them off one by one, and at one point decided to cut through the library, a huge, centrally constructed room which was bordered on all sides by the 4 upstairs hallways. As he went through it in the dark, he heard something off to his right, a soft voice which startled him. It was a male voice, repeating something again and again. The janitor followed it over to a side wall. He was shocked to see someone lying on a long countertop near a copy machine. It was a student, soon to be identified as Kirk Nevitt. Kirk was lying on the countertop, physically unhurt, though it became obvious that he had been lying there for what might have been several days. During that time, apparently, he had never moved. He had not eaten and had very noticeably lost weight, as if intentionally starved. Beside his head was a small blue plastic bowl, a dog dish. It was half filled with lukewarm water. Kirk lay face up, repeating a single phrase again and again, quietly, to no one. He stopped speaking when the janitor roused him out of his strange stupor, but he said nothing more to anyone for another 24 hours, at which time he finally began to emerge from the bizarre waking coma he'd been trapped in. His logical memories ended with walking toward the Redstone Mall on the 27th. There were no signs on his body of being bound or restrained in any way. As the police interviewed Kirk further in the hospital, and he became more and more lucid, nursed and fed slowly back to full health, he started to recall unusual things, like being asked, not commanded, but asked by a soft male voice to lie down and remain in place, not moving a muscle, unless he had to turn his head to drink. His impressions of what happened between lying down and the time he was discovered were patchy and confused. Something had happened in his mind which made him too weak to move. Whenever he tried, he could barely raise his arm an inch off the countertop. He'd never felt afraid, though, just slowly more and more disinterested in trying to get up. His rational thoughts had been replaced by a thick mental fog in which he forgot his own name. He had a vague recollection of the lights around him being turned on and off once or twice, but he had no memory of ever being touched. Only his dreams had been vivid, dreams of floating above town, and bizarrely of walking through its deserted streets in the middle of the night, killing spiders that appeared around every corner by the dozens. These dreams especially had seemed to go on and on and on. Most of these details never made the newspaper, which reported only that Kirk had been found inside the school, but did not say how he'd gotten there. Kirk didn't return to Telford High that year, kept at home while he underwent several evaluations, physical and psychological. It was from my father again that I learned that there would most likely never be any explanation for why he had lain on that countertop, slowly starving for 5 days. My father told me that whoever had led him there and left the room while he lay still must have returned a couple of times to refill the water dish, or Kirk would have died of thirst. They'd searched for signs of forced entry, but there were none. Unfortunately, the police found 3 different ways to enter the school without breaking any locks. My father rarely tried to hide anything from me, and it was he who told me what Kirk had been saying to no one over and over again when the janitor approached him in the dark. He'd been saying, "The shed will fill with the baby's blood." It was utter nonsense. They tried and tried, apparently, to link that phrase to something, but never did. It was more than 2 weeks after Kirk was found that my father finally went to talk to Garrett Markish. The case was going nowhere, and my father, as he sometimes did with the cases that baffled and fascinated him, was more or less going out on his own to try to understand more about what had happened. I remember it was a Thursday night that he came back to the house unusually late, around 10 o'clock. I was in the kitchen cutting myself a piece of cake. My mother and my 12-year-old brother were upstairs. He was teaching her Excel for her job in a publishing house. My father sat down next to me at the kitchen table and told me where he'd been. Garrett lived in a foster home, the oldest of 4 kids who lived there. This was the 3rd foster home he lived in. His parents had died in an accident when he was 2. My father told me he'd spoken to Garrett for an hour, and though he had no evidence that he'd had anything to do with Kirk Nevitt's bizarre disappearance and reappearance, he wanted me to stay far clear of him. I would have taken my father at his word about this, since I knew he'd developed and honed a sense of someone being bad news that the rest of us just didn't have. But he made a particular emphasis of his point that night. Nothing, he said, was right about Garrett Markish, and I especially was not to antagonize him in any way. I said I understood, a little disappointed that my father would think I would ever do such a thing. Looking back, I think that wasn't his point at all. He'd only been trying to emphasize how very dangerous Garrett was without being able to put the specifics into words. Word got out well enough about what had really happened to Kirk Nevitt, and the students of Telford High did look at Garrett differently then. You could sense that people made a specific point of avoiding him rather than just ignoring him. I don't recall anyone, even my friends speaking openly about the possibility that Garrett had somehow caused Kirk's affliction. But it hung there all the same. There was no way this weak stick figure of a kid could have intimidated Kirk into accepting that torture. Yet the aura that surrounded Garrett from that point on was palpable. It was said that Kirk had a long way to go to make a full psychological recovery, that he developed an intense fear of the dark and falling asleep with no one else in the room. There was a rumor that Garrett alone was the reason Kirk wanted to stay out of school, but this had no basis in fact from what I knew. Garrett himself missed a week of school in February, supposedly with the flu. One afternoon during that stretch, I was in the English wing walking down the hallway toward a meeting of the yearbook club when I detected a strong odor, a sour, almost rancid smell. Another student, a 10th grader named Jeremy Vogt, was walking a little behind me, and when I turned and involuntarily made a face, he was doing the same. A math teacher, Mr. Bush, came out of his room up ahead of us and asked us if we smelled something bad. It was almost an inadvertently funny question, since the odor was almost overpowering where he was. There was a long bank of lockers across the hallway from his room, and grimacing, the three of us traced the odor to a specific section of lockers. Mr. Bush opened the ones that were unlocked, seeing nothing in any of them that was of any concern. He said he was going to find one of the janitors and ask if there was a way to get into the 3 or 4 lockers that were the most likely suspects. Jeremy Vogt walked off, headed home, losing interest and more than a little revolted. But instead of going on to my meeting, I actually waited for Mr. Bush to return from making his call. I knew that Garrett Markish's locker was right in front of me. I remembered seeing it after it was defaced by Kirk Nevitt, or whoever had done it. There was no proof it was Kirk. So I was alone there in the hallway for a minute. The regular school day had ended a half hour before, so no one walked past. That odor was unlike anything I had ever sensed, an odor of rot and smoke. I reached out to Garrett's locker, feeling a definite sense of trespass, that I was doing something wrong. Still, I closed my hand around the padlock that guarded it, and then gave it a meaningless tug, duplicating the one Mr. Bush had given it. Of course it held firm. Then I idly began to rotate the dial, continuing to tug on the padlock lightly as I cycled, just once through 10 numbers or so. All of a sudden the lock gave cleanly. Like I sometimes did when I was impatient, Garrett had snapped the lock tight, but then given the wheel only a quarter turn, having no reason to think anyone would want in. Looking back once over my shoulder down the hallway, I opened the locker. Inside it was the usual profusion of random papers and even a bag of some incredibly old Oreo cookies. But then there was the jar. It was a small thing with a Smucker's grape jam label still on it, half torn away, though those contents had been washed out some time before. I took the jar into my hand and looked at what was inside. For a moment I thought what I was seeing was a miniature from some role-playing game. Garrett certainly seemed the type to be into something like that. It was a tiny black and gray dog figure, intricately sculpted and painted from the look of it. Because it looked so strange, and because I wanted to determine if it was the sole cause of the odor, I unscrewed the lid of the jar. I winced and turned my face away immediately. This object was clearly the only cause. I stared at it longer and had such trouble believing my eyes that I felt compelled to put a finger into the jar in order to touch the dog. You have to imagine what a Doberman Pinscher would look like if it died or were killed and left in the woods for a couple of days, or more accurately, mummified. Then imagine it was only 2 inches long. The sculpt, or whatever it was, had incredibly tiny but complete features, including sealed eyes. Its little mouth was frozen in a snarl with one tiny fang protruding. My finger touched the side of its body, and I felt a fur-like substance matted down. The body gave ever so slightly when I pushed down on the exposed side. I felt a wave of horror and disgust then, and I would have sworn in court that what I was touching was once a living thing. I screwed the lid back on the jar and put it back in the locker. Disgusted, I wiped my fingers again and again on my shirt. Mr. Bush returned after only another minute, and I told him I had managed to open the locker. Thinking of fingerprints, I confessed I'd touched everything and was sure the jar was the cause of the odor. Then I walked quickly away, not telling him I had really gotten a good look at anything in particular. He mumbled a word of thanks to me and said he'd see me tomorrow. And that was the last I knew of that jar, or Mr. Bush's reaction to it, when he almost certainly opened it as I had. Instead of continuing to my yearbook meeting, I simply went home, feeling ill. That night I went back and forth about telling my father what I'd seen in the locker. I finally did as he sat in his easy chair reading a novel. He listened attentively and questioned me on several details which seemed unimportant to me, but which to his detective's mind were quite the opposite. He asked me how old the jam label was and what sort of dog that sculpt represented, and if I remembered if the papers in the locker were schoolwork or something other than that. He reminded me once again about my promise to steer clear of Garrett, which from now on included his things. I apologized for opening the locker and told him frankly that my curiosity had just plain overpowered me. He said he could understand that. I said goodnight and turned to walk up the stairs to my room. Halfway up, he stopped me and asked me one more thing, which was if there had been any writing on the jar or maybe any unusual symbols written on it by hand. I told him no. That was where we left off. Garrett returned to Telford after his bout with the flu, and I never heard anything more about the incident. I had my chances to ask Mr. Bush about what he had done with the jar, but I never did. Even speaking about Garrett gave me an eerie feeling. It was toward the end of March that I had my one and only real encounter with Garrett. Since winter, he'd only retreated further and further into his own world, which was fine with everyone, but made me increasingly nervous. Once, out at the movies with my friends, someone made a reference to a serial killer character in the film we'd just seen, and he drew a lazy parallel to Garrett. And not only did I not laugh, but I wondered aloud if I was the only one who was genuinely worried about what he might do. More and more when I saw him, I would notice little details about his increasingly disheveled appearance, like his habit of wearing the exact same thing all the time and not shaving, that sort of thing. Or a new tattoo I noticed on his neck. I couldn't imagine there wasn't more concern about him being a real threat to either himself or all the rest of us. He just seemed like that kind of enigma, that kind of ticking time bomb. My friends became quiet for a brief moment, and then Rich Griffin, kind of a genius who would at 21 drop out of college to be hired as a full-time reporter for the New York Times, said he thought about this all the time. And he knew a teacher in the English department, he felt uncomfortable, he said, about telling us which one, was so much the same way that she was in occasional meetings with the principal about what could be done legally to possibly intervene in Garrett's life. Then Mike Beck, whose left arm would be crushed 40 days later in the stampede resulting from the massacre that Garrett would perpetrate, told us he'd gotten so nervous about Garrett that he'd found himself approaching him and asking him if he'd like to join the school's filmmaking group that occasionally made short videos for YouTube. He thought maybe Garrett was the creative type. He'd heard he played guitar. Garrett had only muttered, "No thanks," and Mike had dropped it quickly. It was clear that I wasn't the only one musing upon Garrett and mentally tracking his withdrawal from his fellow students. But it didn't make me feel any better. March 21st, the first day of spring, was cold and rainy. I drove my mother's station wagon to school that day so I could come home late from the library, buried as I was in a term paper about the life of George Mason. I got antsy there after only an hour or so, and I decided to leave around 5:30, near dusk. Driving home down Elm Tree Road, I saw Garrett walking down the side of the road in the rain, without an umbrella. I suppose I had Mike Beck's story of how he had tried to reach out to Garrett still firm in my mind, and I directly violated my father's trust by pulling over to the curb, stepping out of the car, and asking Garrett if he wanted to ride with me wherever he needed to go. Or maybe there was something darker in my motives. Maybe it was more about a gnawing curiosity and a desire to look into this kid's eyes and truly see whether he was good or just maybe something unclassifiable. And yes, I think now there was an element of selfishness in it, an element of self-preservation. I wanted to be on this person's good side. There's no real doubt about it. I was honestly scared of him, and I wanted him to think of me as something other than one of them, the kids who either ignored him or mocked him behind his back. To my surprise, he murmured an unenthusiastic acceptance of my offer and got into the car. As we pulled away from the curb, I asked him where he was walking from, and he said the music shop. I told him I had heard he was into music, but he only shrugged and said he was sometimes, but that he wasn't that interested in it anymore. We drove in silence for a time through the rain. He said he was only headed toward a friend's house and said I could drop him off at the entrance to Forbes Park, which was a dumpy grouping of athletic fields bordering a residential community. I offered to drive him to the front door of his friend's house, whoever that might have been, but he said no, he didn't want to get there too early, and would just read for a little while at the bus shelter in front of the park. I didn't persist. I asked him what kinds of things he liked to read, and he recited the names of a couple of science fiction authors I knew and some philosophers I definitely did not. I managed to catch some details of his recent tattoo, the one he'd gotten on the side of his neck. It was small but clear, its colors dark blue and gray and black. It depicted a hooded figure that appeared to be holding a lantern in an outstretched arm. In just a couple of minutes we were at the park, and I swung in and he thanked me quietly and got out of the car. What happened next I saw only because my attention remained partially on Garrett as he closed the car door and started walking toward the bus shelter about 30 feet away across a small grass divider patch in the lot. I kept watching him because I was about to say, "See you at school," in the friendliest tone I could muster. Otherwise I would have already turned my head to look through the windshield and would have completely missed the occurrence which I only caught out of the corner of my eye as I swallowed the words I meant to say and started to focus my attention elsewhere. On Garrett's 7th or 8th step away from the car, I heard, very vividly, the sound of a heavy slap, as if a person's closed fist had connected with another's flesh, and I saw Garrett's head rock to the left side as if struck hard by a stone thrown in his direction. His stride was actually interrupted by the blow, and I would swear that he instantly made the decision to simply absorb it without letting on to anyone who might be watching that anything out of the ordinary had happened. There was not even a glance on his part toward the woods, where something would have to have come from to jolt his head the way it did. He kept walking, not even raising a hand to his head. There was no stone, nothing visible to cause this violence. As soon as I registered what happened, I called out to Garrett, asking him if he was all right. Without turning around, he merely raised a hand silently and dropped it again as if to say yes. It had all happened in the space of 2 seconds. I pulled quickly away and turned the car toward the road, my heart pounding. I forced myself not to look back. Again and again in my mind I heard that slap. Only when I turned onto the road did I steal a glance in the rearview mirror, where I saw Garrett pulling a book out of his backpack as he settled himself on the bus shelter's bench. I could see even from that distance that the hair over his right ear was mussed a bit compared to the left. He made no move to smooth it out. It was that dedication to ignoring what had happened that made me think he had no reason to be surprised at being struck, that it had happened before. But what had done it, I would never know. Sometimes I wonder at the timing of the act, how it happened just after Garrett had the simplest of conversations with another human being, a relative rarity for him. I didn't sleep very well that night. I kept waking up. At a little past 2 a.m, I decided I was done trying to sleep for a while, and I got up and poked around on the internet for a time, playing some game or the other. Just when I started to feel a little sleepy again, at about 3, I heard our front door open and close downstairs. I was a little alarmed. I wasn't sure who this could be, coming back home so late on a Thursday night. My father hadn't worked late nights for 2 years. My brother Ben, I assumed, was sound asleep in the room beside me. He had no reason to be out either. I threw some sweatpants on and went downstairs to find my father in the kitchen making himself a sandwich. He was sweating for some reason, quite a lot, despite the fact that it couldn't have been more than 50 degrees outside. I asked him where he was coming back from. He said Gregory Gerganis, who used to be his partner some years before, had come up with a tip regarding something my father had been working on, and he wanted to go out and act on it while he had the chance. He said he couldn't tell me more. I made a leap of logic in that moment, and unwisely I asked if the tip had anything to do with Garrett Markish. My father had visited Kirknevitt twice in the past 3 weeks, asking him more questions. The answer to my own question that night was no. His trip out had nothing to do with all that. My father told me he was very tired and needed to go to sleep, and he would talk to me later. I asked him why he was sweating, and he said he was just wearing one too many layers. And then he went upstairs in the middle of making his sandwich. He just left the meat and the bread out as if he had forgotten what he was doing in the middle of it. I went to bed too, but I laid awake till almost dawn. The police arrested Garrett the very next morning as he left his house and started to walk to school. My father was not involved. In fact, he didn't even go to work that day, sleeping really late. The charge against Garrett was unusual: animal theft. Evidence had been found that Garrett had abducted a dog belonging to a family living 3 doors down from him. This had apparently happened back in February. The dog had never been found. My father would claim that he knew nothing about any of this. I could tell he was lying. This man who dealt with liars all his life was just too honest to be a convincing one himself. Though I knew everyone at school was aware of what had happened to Garrett, you could read the story's vague details online, I never heard anyone speak of it, bizarre as it was. The silence struck me as forced somehow, as if Garrett's name had finally become verboten. I believe now that he had inadvertently managed to work his way into our collective consciousness in a way that made us all feel so uneasy that talking about him made it far worse. He was a shadow that had fallen across Telford High, and we all just wanted to pretend he no longer existed. There was nothing about him that was darkly exciting to discuss, like with most controversial kids. To the contrary, everything about Garrett was unpleasant to think about, disturbing to muse upon. So all of us, teachers and students alike, went speechless. But his absence from school worried me even more somehow. We knew he'd been arrested, but none of us knew where he was now. I wondered about it constantly. I think if I had known his address, I might well have made a detour to simply walk down that street, turning my head in the most subtle way possible as I passed his house to see if I could maybe spot him in an upstairs window. I had a developing sense of dread about him, which his absence intensified day by day. I wanted to speak to someone about how I felt something terrible coming. How I dreamed one night of being on a train somewhere in the desert, all my classmates sitting around me as we rolled through a dark, featureless landscape, and Mr. Bush walking down the aisle between the seats carrying an axe. He was telling everyone to stay calm, for the moment was coming when he would have to stop Garrett from sending the train off the tracks, killing us all. He was asking each one of us how we intended to help him stop Garrett. And when he came to me, he said the way I could best help was to get this mark off his skin. And he pointed to a tattoo on his neck depicting a robed figure holding a lantern in one outstretched arm. When I told Mr. Bush I didn't know how I was going to do that, he told me angrily that it would be my fault then, that the shed would fill with the baby's blood. He held the axe out to me in the dark, demanding I take care of things myself. And it was then that I awoke, crying for the first time in years. Friday, April 30th, 2004, was the day before my father disappeared. I spent the evening at Mike Beck's house in his basement, helping him paint part of his massive model train layout, something we worked on together once every few weeks. We would put on some music and just chill out with this big, crazy project that had no end. His parents were across town, out at dinner. We'd been working for about an hour and a half, and it was a little past 9, when all of a sudden, the power went out. We were in darkness. We laughed nervously. While I waited, Mike went upstairs to find a flashlight, and he noticed through the living room window that none of the other houses on the road had lost their power. The only sound out there was the neighbor's dog, a temperamental Labrador retriever, barking loudly, which would not normally be a cause for alarm, but which I would remember later on. I thought we should go outside and look up and down the street to see if maybe a crew was working on something nearby. So we went out and looked left and right. We didn't see anything. Back inside, Mike thought about calling his parents to let them know they shouldn't hurry back anytime soon. It was their first night out since their newborn had arrived. They'd left Sandra with a sitter. In the end, he didn't make the call. It had now been about 20 minutes total since the power had gone out. Not quite sure what to do, we'd returned to the basement and Mike had started rooting around for candles. Then something else occurred to him and we passed through the laundry room to snake our way back through a narrow passageway to the space where the water heater and the fuse box were. Taking a look inside the fuse box, we saw that every single fuse was in the off position, with no exceptions, as if they had all tripped at once. One by one, Mike set them all active again, and the lights came back on all over the house. Problem solved. He asked me if I knew how fuses worked, if it was possible that they would all flip simultaneously instead of just one or two. I wasn't sure. I was musing upon it when I saw that Mike's face had gone slack, and he put a hand out to silence me. He said, "I just saw something outside." Through the tiny ground-level basement window above our heads, he'd seen a pair of legs moving quickly past it, maybe a foot beyond the glass. We moved swiftly out of the laundry room and up the stairs, where we split up and looked through all the bigger windows on the front of the house. Nothing was out there in the side garden or the driveway or the street beyond. We then went to the back of the house, into the kitchen, Mike peered through the window set into the back door at the porch. Then he froze. He told me that the door to the shed at the edge of the yard was open. He couldn't remember if anyone had left it that way, but it didn't seem like that would have made any sense. He told me to step back toward the refrigerator, so neither of us could be seen from out there. We watched the shed for a time from our limited sight line. I could just barely see what Mike was talking about. The door was open, just a crack. Nothing out there moved. As the minutes passed, Mike became more and more convinced that someone was in there. I offered to call the police, but Mike shook his head. He just wanted to wait a few minutes. I asked him if he was absolutely sure he'd seen someone pass by that basement window, and he said he was about 90% sure. 90%. It was almost 10 more minutes before we decided to go out into the backyard. If we got near the shed and something seemed really wrong, we would call the police. Mike was even hesitant to turn the light on that illuminated the back porch, and not much more. When it was on, it actually made the rear of the backyard darker because of the shadows created by that light. We opened the back door and headed out. Mike was holding a hammer he'd scavenged from a drawer, and I held the flashlight. At first, we ventured no further than the back porch. Mike called out, "Is anyone there?" To this, the only response that came was the barking of the neighbor's dog again. We waited. Nothing stirred. Beyond the backyard, the land opened up. Everyone in the community had 3 to 5 acres to themselves, with very few trees around. Some of the houses beyond had lights on in their windows, some didn't. The door to the shed was open perhaps 8 or 9 inches. Mike swore under his breath, mostly I thought at his own fear. We moved onto the lawn and slowly moved to within about 10 feet of the shed, unable to see much of anything through that crack. It was eerie how in the dark that shed suddenly resembled the entrance to some tomb. Finally, Mike strode forward all at once and threw the shed door open wide. The door swung all the way on its hinges, creaking loudly. Then there was a sharp crack as its arc reached its limit, and it swung all the way back, almost shutting again until I stepped forward and caught it with one hand. I was prepared to rush in there. But the beam of the flashlight fell on nothing more than lawn equipment, a couple of bicycles, and stacks of old magazines. After that, we spread out and covered some ground around the house and in the street, but it all came to nothing. Regrouping back inside, we examined the laundry room and the area around the fuse box. Maybe it had been nothing more than a massively overloaded circuit that had caused the outage, and there was nothing to obsess over. Mike didn't want to worry his parents just yet. He would look into it and not say anything. For the rest of the evening, until his parents returned, we watched a movie upstairs, very loud, all the lights on, all the doors locked. We tried not to think about what had happened. Mike walked me out around 11:30. All he could think about, and he said he knew it was ridiculous, was that Garrett had been at the house that night. He told me about the feeling he'd gotten when making eye contact with him on the day he'd spoken to him about the filmmaking group. A feeling of having made a huge mistake, as if he had trespassed without knowing it, and Garrett suddenly perceived him as a threat. But he would never call the police with so groundless a suspicion. There was nothing to be done right now. After all, was Mike seriously suggesting that Garrett had maybe gotten into the house somehow? For what reason? With what plan? Nobody was on the street when I went the 4 blocks home. The few hours of sleep I would get that night would be the most I'd get for months, as real, tangible horror came into my life. My kid brother was the one who found the note my father had left behind on the kitchen table the next morning. It was Saturday, and Ben came down to eat breakfast before going out on his bicycle with some other kids, and he saw a single sheet of paper tucked beneath a salt shaker. In my father's friendly, oversized handwriting were the words, "See you later!" written in ballpoint pen. None of us thought much about it, as on Saturdays he was very likely to go off to the hardware store early to begin some kind of home improvement project. But he wasn't back by noon, and he wasn't answering his cell phone. When night fell, and there was still no word from him, my mother called Gregory Gerganis in a panic. He had no idea where my father was. By midnight, my mother had taken some sleeping pills to knock herself out so she wouldn't have a breakdown from her worry and stress. My father's friends in the police force, who knew he was happily married for going on 19 years, and thus had no reason to leave us so baffled, went into action right away and did everything they could to find him. As I lay awake in the middle of the night, the thought that my father had some sort of secret life or deeply hidden reason for vanishing none of us could hope to understand was undermined by the more likely scenario that he had gone out on a lead of some kind, on a case we didn't know about, and had been abducted or killed. Never in his career had he ever given us a sense that he was ever in any sort of real danger, but we knew it was possible. By Sunday night, my mother was on prescription medication to control her panic, and I and my brother were unable to really eat or sleep. The note my father had left was taken away and examined with the greatest care, its image burned into our minds. I didn't go to school Monday or Tuesday as the detectives further investigated my father's disappearance. On Wednesday, I retrieved the mail from the box in front of our house and felt on the verge of passing out when I touched an envelope bearing my father's handwriting. It had been postmarked in Los Angeles, California, 1,800 miles away, the previous Saturday, which meant it would have to have been sent the same day he'd vanished. Out of sight of my mother, I opened the envelope and pulled out a single piece of orange notepaper and a photograph. The note was again written in my father's handwriting, and it said exactly the same thing as the first one. "See you later!" I stared at the photograph for minutes, shaking. It was a Polaroid he seemed to have taken of himself, holding the camera out at arm's length. He was standing in front of a storefront on a bright, sunny day. He was smiling into the camera in an easy, disarming way. He was wearing a football jersey with the number 32. It was the one I'd bought him as a birthday present 6 weeks before. That moment was when I knew that Garrett Markish had sent my father away, or rather, convinced him it was time to vanish from his job, his family, his entire life, because he'd uncovered too many of Garrett's secrets on his late-night investigations. I imagined Garrett had done it with a single sentence, word, or wave of his hand, summoning a power none of us could conceive of. I knew then that he was a monster. I went to Gregory Gerganis, and in a small spare room at the precinct house where he and my father worked, I told him all of my feelings and all of my suspicions in private. Not even my mother or my brother were there. It was 7 p.m. on May 5th. It took me about a half an hour to lay out all my thoughts to Gregory, who'd been a family friend for 10 years. He swore to me right then that my father would be found, and he would be found alive, that he didn't think he should wait any longer to act on what he himself suspected. He wanted me to forget about Garrett, go home, be with my mother, and try to resume my life. My father would be found, but it was vital that I act normally and not do anything about what I believed. The search for my father that had begun in Telford would spread to Los Angeles immediately, but the fact that there was no evidence whatsoever of foul play, and that there were now 2 notes and a photograph, seemingly made in a voluntary way by the missing, would soon make it difficult for the men who knew my father to get the resources they really needed. I had no doubt that Gregory would be relentless, but he faced a number of obstacles, and I felt my hopes fading. Within hours it would be found that no one with my father's name had traveled by public jet to California that weekend. And yet he had just appeared there. From the precinct house, I walked that night through downtown Telford, toward the nearest bus stop, where I waited for only a few minutes before walking on. I needed to walk, to be unconfined and process my thoughts. I needed miles of moving alone and unseen simply to settle down. It was a warm, pretty spring night. I paid no attention to the traffic, to the people on the street, though as soon as I moved onto a quieter road, I panicked, feeling exposed and watched. I needed to be around people, to lose myself among them. I took a turn onto Markle Avenue and started to walk 1.5 miles toward Telford High, where I knew the first round of the state soccer championships were starting, with Telford scheduled to play a 7:30 game against Severn Grove. There would be almost 1,000 people there most likely, and for just a while I could drown in the noise and the chaos and the benign meaninglessness of the crowd until I became sane again. I could hear the Telford band playing their version of an old David Bowie song from 2 blocks over, and see the glow of the arc lights over the houses in the residential neighborhood beside the school. A man and wife were walking with their 2 young children in the same direction. Soccer was a bigger deal in Telford than football, with the team having won the state finals 2 years in a row, and lots of people got involved. When I got to the field, I paid my $3 admission for a ticket at the short brick facade that served as an entrance and went into what was charitably called a stadium. It was really just 2 giant sets of cheap metal bleacher seats on opposite sides of a chronically muddy football field, with a scoreboard on one end and a rising hill on the other where some kids would hang out and watch the game for free. I sat in the half-filled east side bleachers that night, climbing 20 rows from the front to a spot all the way in the back so I could disappear more easily. The game was just starting the second half, but I barely registered this, even though I tried to focus and take my mind off its relentlessly grim track. The school building, darkened and somewhat haunted-looking at night, rose behind the west bleachers, where there was a slightly bigger crowd. Over the school, the sky glowed a bit from the light pollution coming from the center of town. It was 8:40 p.m. Around me, people who had only 20 more minutes of life on this earth watched the game and chatted and cheered for their friends and their children. I would learn much later that a friend of mine who'd already arranged to be my college roommate come September was sitting directly opposite me in the back row of the west bleachers. He would become one of 2 people who were never fully found after that night. Severn Grove had just kicked in their second goal, almost but not quite dashing Telford High's hopes of a repeat championship, when I spotted Garrett on the hill beside the woods on the south side of the field, small in my vision. There were maybe 15 or 20 people spread out over the hill watching the game, and Garrett was alone among them, off by himself. He was sitting with his arms draped over his knees and his head hanging down, his face unseen, as if he were asleep. Beside him was his rumpled dark blue backpack. I stared at him, willing him to look up so I could see his face. It took me no time at all to decide that I was going to confront him. I wasn't even surprised to see him. It all made sense somehow. It felt like fate. While the crowd murmured and sighed about the game's tough turn, I stood up, keeping my eye on Garrett. He didn't move. I made my way back down the bleachers to the front row and descended 3 steps to the ground level and began to walk toward the hill. I was at about the 30-yard line, and I would have to detour around the chain-link fence that surrounded the field, so it would take me a few minutes to get there. As soon as I left the bleachers, I saw Garrett raise his head and look at the field. He slowly got to his feet as I watched him carefully. It almost seemed like he sensed I was coming and had reacted to my presence. On that night, he was wearing a maroon-colored sweatshirt and jeans. The closest people to him were a guy and a girl, about 10 feet away, each drinking something out of a styrofoam cup, unaware that he was behind them. As I kept walking, I saw Garrett reach into his backpack and pull out what was obviously a very long, very large knife. Its blade probably 1.5 feet long, almost a short sword. I broke into a run. Something horrible was about to happen. Garrett raised the blade in front of him and with both hands gripped it, placing the point on his chest. I began to shout then, crying, "Hey!" over and over again, just so the people around Garrett would look. Someone finally did, a bald man sitting nearby. He began to get up but looked confused about what he was seeing. I had reached the end of the chain-link fence and had gotten to the base of the hill when Garrett started to push that blade into his own chest. I heard a scream then from far behind me as someone in the bleachers saw what I was seeing. The videotape recovered after the tragedy, which has never been released to the public but which Gregory Gerganis showed me last year after I begged him to, captures the entire scene from beginning to almost the end. It was taken by the assistant soccer coach, Nick Cheadle, who was sitting in the 5th row of the east bleachers so he could get a wider view of the field. It wasn't any sort of official tape of the game he was making that night, so his camera wandered around a lot. When he sensed a commotion around him and saw people pointing toward the hill, he turned the camera that way in time to see Garrett Markish sinking to his knees with the blade sticking out of his chest 1/4 of the way in. When you're watching the tape, the camera stays on him for only 2 seconds, very shaky, and then it whips back to the field because the screams have taken on a sudden intensity as something begins to happen on the field. The Telford and Severn Grove players have all stopped for a free kick from roughly the center of the field when the ground there opens up. A fissure forms without a sound, and one Severn Grove player is seen to back away from it with his hands high in the air. The fissure grows rapidly, spreading outwards from a central point at about the 40-yard line, creating a wider and wider hole. Nick Cheadle held the camera on this phenomenon as best he could. As Garrett Markish sunk his blade deeper and deeper into his chest up on the hill, the hole widened and widened. On the tape there was no accompanying noise, no roar or echo. You can hear the thudding of feet on metal as people begin to evacuate the bleachers all around Nick Cheadle, who himself begins to move, continuing to tape until it becomes obvious he's in mortal danger. On the tape you can see 2 Telford soccer players, who had begun to run as fast as they could toward the far sideline, drop into darkness as the ever-widening pit devours the field. They fall in when the pit is about 50 feet by 50 feet wide. As Garrett pushed the last of his blade into his chest and people surrounded him, the pit expanded twice as fast. Screams almost obliterate the tape's audio as it sees more players descend into the sinkhole, and clouds of dust rise from it. The last thing you really see of the disaster is the pit spreading to the west, toward the bleachers on that side. That is when the picture becomes too shaky to watch as the man owning the camera abandons the recording and begins to run with the camera in his hand, his breathing labored, the words, oh my God," spoken again and again and again. I had almost gotten to Garrett when I stopped and joined the rest of the people on the hill in helplessly watching the disaster unfold. The people standing on the far sidelines who hadn't already run for safety disappeared into the pit. And then it was under the bleachers, where there were still more than 100 people who hadn't been able to get down to the steps. I saw people leaping off the bleachers in desperation, but the rickety central part of them collapsed into the pit all at once, pulling everything else in with it. There was a gigantic plume of dust and debris. Almost lost in the screaming was the moaning of the metal as it buckled. People vanished into the pit, which would tear to an unthinkable depth of 120 feet. Many of the deaths were from people falling on others who had already plummeted. Across the field on the east side, where I had come from, there was a stampede into the parking lot, people running as fast as they could into it and beyond it, having no idea what was happening to the earth around them. Almost everyone on the hill had run into the woods, and I went too after taking one glance at the space where Garrett was, face down on the ground, kneeling but motionless, a pool of blood around him. The pit stopped growing suddenly after it consumed the bleachers, and I figure that was when Garrett had technically died. The two happened at the exact same moment, certainly. I followed people into the woods, into the dark, running as fast as I could, seeing mothers and fathers and students all around me, branches scraping them, people tripping and falling as they wept and shouted for one another. We all reached Bottomford Road in about 2 minutes, and people there were stopping, feeling it might be safe to rest and collect themselves. They hugged each other and frantically got on their cell phones. One female student was shouting to another that John was in the bleachers. John had never left. And the girl she was babbling at said, I know, it's okay. I turned and looked through the trees. The glare of the lights back there was dimming in an enormous rising cloud of dust. Everything in that direction was seen only through the haze which blotted out the stars to the north. Telford High itself remained standing, visible as a dark hump under the sky. The sinkhole had stopped growing several hundred feet from the building. Garrett Markish had not lived long enough to destroy it. More than 6 people were eventually pulled from that pit. They were all Garrett's victims, though no one will ever be able to prove that. I know it. Gregory Gerganis knows it, and so does my father, who returned to us a month after the massacre, appearing on our front porch one morning. My mother found him sleeping in a plastic chair out there, and when she roused him, he remembered nothing of the previous 2 months of his life, nor did he remember any of us for several more agonizing weeks. He'd lost 40 pounds and suffered severe burns on his back, an infection from which almost killed him. There are many, many others who suspect that Garrett caused it all. Kirk Nevitt's torture, the strange curse placed on a random dog, the events of that hellish May night. Entire books have been written, including one by a Telford High teacher. Engineers and geologists will talk about water tables and fault lines and natural phenomena that can cause sudden tears in the earth. But everyone in Telford certainly believes Garrett Markish was evil. No one knows what his aggrieved foster parents, who never understood him, believe. They've long since moved out of town and can't be found anymore. They let police search Garrett's room after his death, but nothing of value was discovered. It was believed he had cleared everything out of there, destroying all but his most basic possessions, a couple of days before his suicide. The blade he used to do it was traced to a local pawn shop. There was nothing special or unusual about it. Telford High changed its name to Belfaver High at the end of my freshman year of college.